Okay, everybody, it is 1 minute past the hour, and I think by good courtesy of online meeting protocol, that is a perfect time to get started with this conversation. Welcome, everybody. My name is Claes de Vreese. I'm one of the principal investigators in the University of Amsterdam research priority area on humane AI, together with Tobias Blanke, Sonja Smit, and Natalie Hellberger. We're delighted that you're all joining us today. We have set up a series of webinars. So far, we've had 3 conversations. We are in an informal and chatting mode of presentation here. So we will have some short introductions and then there will be a discussion. I'm delighted after we have had Max Welling and Beate Rüssler and Thomas Brill on the floor to be welcoming 2 people to our stage today. We have first of all Sennay Ghebreab, and then we have Hinda on the stage. Sennay is working also at the University of Amsterdam and is chairing our Civic AI Lab at the university, which is a collaboration between the city, the Ministry of Interior Affairs, and the Free University. Hinda has a past as a data scientist at Ahold Delhaize and has joined also and is currently co-director of the Civic AI Lab. We are delighted to have you both on the floor, and today's conversation will be led by Sarah Eskens. Sarah is a former direct colleague of mine at the University of Amsterdam at the Institute for Information Law, has finished her PhD dissertation and has moved on to work for our wonderful competitors and colleagues at the Free University of Amsterdam. I will give Sarah the floor, and she will do the conversational part of this, and afterwards there will be an opportunity to do Q&A in the chat. What is very important is that we are also recording today's conversation, and it will be made available as a podcast. So that's important for you to know if you think about raising your questions in the chat with your name. I welcome all of you again, and I give Sarah the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Claes, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion. I'm really looking forward. Actually, I'm just going to pass on the floor immediately to Sennay and Hinda, I think, who can start with the presentation. And then thereafter, I will ask a few questions, and then we can open the discussion for the audience as well.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Claes and Sarah. Let me start the presentation. So, if correct, you will be able to see my presentation now. Again, thank you for having us this humane conversation together with Hinda. Let me start by giving you a bit more information on Civic AI Lab, and then we can go into discussion and conversation. As Claes said at the beginning, the Civic AI Lab is part of the ICAI, the National Innovation Center for AI, where public and public-private collaborations take place. In our case, as Claes said at the beginning, the collaboration is with the University of Amsterdam, the Free University of Amsterdam, the City of Amsterdam, and the Ministry of Interior. In the study that was published last year by Van Wees and colleagues, an attempt was made to answer the question how AI is impacting society. They focus on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 160 related targets, which, as you will probably know, aim at a more inclusive, just and sustainable society by 2030. The first goal is to end extreme poverty. Other goals focus on health, education, sustainable energy, climate change, and reducing inequality. It's a very interesting study. Suggest you to read this. Gives quite a lot of information on AI and the impact of AI on society. And what the study reveals is that AI has positive impact on almost 8% of the SDGs, and a negative impact on 35% of SDGs. And what I found striking in this is that the negative impact of AI is high predominantly for SDGs 4, quality of education, and SDG 10, reducing inequality. AI turns out to be both an inhibitor and an enabler on almost all targets of these two SDGs. And this also matches our experiences. And when it comes to AI enabling of inequality, we see multiple different reasons, including the following three that I would like to touch upon. One, AI is often developed and used with the aim of optimizing speed and minimizing cost, rather than, for example, promoting equality of opportunity. Two, AI is developed or used in ways that are blind to historical, social, and cultural context, and also inequalities. And three, AI is intentionally used, or in some cases intentionally not used, to maintain status quo and existing power structures and relations. Take AI recruitment systems used by companies to speed up the hiring process. Some of the systems turn out to penalize women applicants. Or take as this example on screen, the AI system used by government in the UK to predict final exam results for students who have not been able to take an exam due to COVID-19. And some of these are based on, at least this system is based in part on location data rather than on individual performance data. And this disadvantages students from certain socioeconomic neighborhoods and backgrounds. AI can thus perpetuate existing socioeconomic inequalities, but it can also help promote equal opportunity if it is designed and developed and deployed with equal opportunity as an objective and with consideration of socioeconomic and historical context. And this is precisely what we aim to do at the Civic AI Lab. The lab's vision is a society in which citizens from all walks of life, including those at the margins of society, get an equal opportunity to contribute to, but also benefit from society. The lab's mission is to develop AI technology that promotes economic and social human rights, such as the right to health, education, and employment, while respecting at the same time fundamental human rights such as privacy, non-discrimination, and equality. The lab has three main research directions. One is the use of data that represents citizens and communities in society in a better and perhaps also a deeper manner. Two, the development of fairness measures that respect differences between citizens and communities. And three, the development of custom-fit algorithms that focus on people and communities instead of focusing on the development of one-size-fits-all algorithms based on centrally pooled data, if you will. I'll skip this slide. So this the projects that I will briefly discuss in a moment have a focus on explainable AI, responsible AI, and socially aware AI, but we try to act on the intersection of these disciplines. We currently have 5 projects in the areas of health, education, well-being, environment, and mobility. And each project aims to increase eventually action perspectives on equality of opportunity in the city of Amsterdam with the help of new AI technology. For example, in the health project, we focus on fair machine learning models that go just beyond the normal mathematical notions of fairness. We, for example, focus on differential fairness measures, which build on the intersectionality theory, and an analytical lens, if you will, from humanities, which analyzes how interlocking systems of power and oppression affect individuals along different dimensions, such as gender, race, sexual orientation, class, and disability. In the education project, we developed Saldonian algorithms for fair distribution of financial resources across children and schools in the city. And such algorithms allow, or at least should allow, decision makers to define undesirable behavior, such as discrimination in resource allocation. We recently started with 5 bright and inspiring PhD students. Here you see them: Sarah, Maesha, Ilse, Tim, and Dimitris. So they will be working on these 5 projects in the coming 4 years, together with our partner city of Amsterdam. Now, how AI will affect society, I think, will very much depend on how well AI will be able to embrace, anchor, enrich human values such as equality, justice, dignity, and also human diversity. And therefore, in all our projects, we value diversity of data, diversity of people with perspectives, diversity of processes and platforms. And we develop AI with interdisciplinary academic teams and in cooperation with governments and industry. But we also strive to involve civil society and citizens in the development, application, and testing of AI. If we want to build AI for social good, AI for all, we can only do that if we build it together. AI for all works only if it's AI by all. Let me end with sharing 3 personal experiences related to these 3 points: cooperation, inclusion, co-creation. Experiences that, looking back, I think motivated me to start a Civic AI Lab. I studied technical information systems at the University of Amsterdam in the early 90s at the science faculty. Following my PhD in computer vision and medical imaging, I consciously made a number of moves to other disciplines. I moved from the science faculty to the medical faculty, where I worked for a number of years, and went back to the science faculty. Then from the science faculty, I made a move to the social science faculty for a number of years. I went back to the science faculty. And again, I made a move to an interdisciplinary institute or faculty, and went back to the science faculty again. And consistently, I experienced disciplinary roles, even though often interdisciplinarity was the credo. Consistently, I experienced lack of representation of population groups in academia, even though diversity and inclusion was often propagated. And consistently, I also missed the link between science and society, even though the impact of science, and in particular of technology, on society was often considered crucial. Outreach was considered crucial, valorization was considered crucial, but I missed a clear link between science and society, between technology and society. So I think there's still a lot of progress to be made in these areas, and what I hope is that with the Civic AI Lab, we can make small steps in the direction, in the right direction. This is what I would like to share with you, and I would like to give you the floor back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sennay, for this introduction. And by the way, also congratulations both to you and Hinda for with the launch of the Civic AI Lab. What I'm particularly interested in when I watched a lot of videos about it is also the local approach that you're taking towards AI questions and biasing issues and everything by cooperating with the city of Amsterdam and everything. Hinda, I would actually like to hear a bit more from you. What kind of personal beliefs or contributions, perspectives do you bring to the Civic AI Lab and to the questions that are being discussed within the context of the lab?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah, for the question. I just want to bring a small correction. When I was introduced, I'm no longer with Ahold Delhaize. I currently work for Janssen Biologics. So my job has slightly changed in terms of the type of projects that I work on. But I'm still a practitioner. I'm still a data scientist, and I lead a team of data analysts. And we're trying to solve all sorts of questions that are raised by our business stakeholders. And that's exactly kind of the contribution I want to make to the Civic AI Lab, is bring more of the hands-on experience. Like, what do people really need in practice when you're a data scientist, for example, and you're building a model? What does that mean for you as a data scientist that your model has to be fair? What does it mean? What does bias mean in your case? Like, do you get agency? Do you get power to decide what type of data sources you're using? And how do you perceive all these developments in the AI community around, bias mitigation, for example, through fairness algorithms or explainability methods? Like, does it actually work? Is it deployable at scale? Can you actually put that in production in your company? And these are very important questions, and I think they can lead to important and interesting research questions. They're not too applied, as I can hear sometimes some colleagues say, they're not algorithmic enough, they're not AI enough. I think that some of the things that I see happening in our field is that people make assumptions about what fairness means or what explainability means, for example, and then they build all sorts of tools around that. But nobody's really wondering, how does this going to work in practice, right? And this is exactly what I'm trying to bring to the lab, is to make people realize is that if they want their methods, their tools, their algorithms, their code to work and to be shared and to be useful, they have to think about how is it going to be actually perceived or used by the people they are developing it for, and if they would spend some time trying to think about these questions and actually being involved in conversations with people who could be their end users, they could actually maybe design algorithms differently or approach the research question they're trying to solve differently. So yeah, typically what I'm trying to bring in this role is a more, let's say, realistic approach to these questions that are researching in the lab.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so I have to admit that for me as a lawyer, I'm not a data scientist or a computer scientist by background, some of these things are still rather abstract when I hear them. Like it's like important principles and values, but I'm trying to better understand how that looks in practice when we're talking, for example, about the Civic AI Lab. And you identified a few areas in which the Civic AI Lab will be active, but could you both provide me with more concrete examples of how you will approach, for example, mobility or one of the other areas? And then, yeah, what is the process around that to make sure that these algorithms that are being designed in the context of the process will be fair and everything?
Do you want to maybe approach this first, and then I'll go next, Sennay?
Sure, go ahead. So I can give you a number of examples that we do. Referring to the project, I already referred to the mobility project. So for all the projects, what we have done is we consulted with the municipality. So the municipality came up with use cases and data, and use cases where they think they can use AI, but would like to use it in a fair, in a responsible, in an inclusive manner, avoiding bias and so on. So we sat together, we identified a number of projects in different social domains, as shown previously, and one of these is mobility. And in the mobility project, what we will be doing is try to address mobility poverty, mobility inequality in the city. Like many other big cities, also in Amsterdam, certain groups have less access to places in the city, to public places. It's not clear who these groups are. To some extent it is, to some extent it is not. So what we try to do is, with AI, try to understand who moves from which part in the city to another part. And are these groups representative or representative for the different population groups in the city? And if not, how come mobility inequality is there, and how can we avoid it? This is one example. Another example, and by the way, this is inspired by the IT Inequality Atlas that was built a few years ago by MIT, where they really met. So in places like Boston, segregation is clear, but so where people live quite segregated in different places, and you don't need AI to see where the place segregation takes place. But movement segregation is something that is unclear. So this mobility or the MIT Inequality Atlas uncovers this mobility inequality. Similarly, we do that with the mobility project in our case. In the health project, or in the well-being project that perhaps Hinda can touch up on in a minute, we look at different, we look, for example, at obesitas, or on the first 1,000 years of a human life. There are a lot of there the source for inequality is created. What are the sources? Are they equally distributed over population groups? If not, how can we identify where the differences arise, and how can we create interventions that will limit discrepancies between different population groups? This is the way we are addressing inequality in our lab.
Thank you. Hinda, do you want to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, with this health example that Sennay just gave, I can tell a little bit about how this will look like in practice. So we have one of our PhD students, Ilse van der Linden, who is working on explainability around a model that would give advice about a particular health intervention, given the data that we have on indeed the first few months of a child's life. And based on all sorts of indicators, we'll be able to give some information about, or a prediction about, what would be the best course of action, for example, to avoid obesity for this child. This is just an example. We haven't built a model like this yet, but this is kind of the intent, is to try and learn from all the information that is there, to together with the health practitioners and the different partners that we have to help them make decisions around this topic. In practice, we will have a model, right? We will have assume like a classification model that's going to make predictions for us. What we want to do is to make sure that these predictions can be challenged, right? So if you get a particular outcome, then you as the person who is at the receiving end of this outcome are able to challenge it, are able to understand it, and we owe you an explanation, right? So in practice, this means that we go into research ways in which people are going to be able to challenge this model, not just by sending an email or kind of having a customer service, but in practice, what it would look like if, I don't know, you're interacting with a health practitioner and he's telling you something about your child's future health, and you're like, okay, I don't agree, or I agree, but if you don't agree, what is the recourse that you have? How can you intervene as a citizen, as someone who's at the receiving end of this complex model that you don't even know it maybe exists, but it's making decisions that affect you? How are we going to incorporate your feedback then, right? And this is what we're looking at it, and not only from an algorithmic point of view, because there, when you think about it algorithmically, we think about explainability, so building explanations on top of a black box model, for example, to try and understand how the model itself reached that decision. But we're also looking at it holistically. So how does it work in this whole pipeline of this model that we're going to put in production, let's say, to use data science terminology? How will it work? How will we capture the feedback from parents of children, for example, or from health practitioners, or from the officials of the city of Amsterdam? So maybe this will be, through a secured, web application. It could be via another mean, but this is how we're thinking about it. And of course, the way we want to do it in practice is have very close collaboration with people who are going to co-develop these models with us, but also the people that will be affected by these models, right? So the parents, the children themselves, and this is all part of what our, let's say, research roadmap is about. It's not just contribute from the algorithmic point of view, which is something that, pretty much everybody knows. Developing a classifier, for example, is not very complicated, but doing it in a way that it provides also explanations, and within a framework where you interact with people that are going to be affected by it, that's something rather new, I would say. And this is what we are going to try and achieve in the coming years.
Thank you. Yeah, so you really try to make the people who are subjected to certain systems part of the feedback loop, so that it's not just a purely data-driven feedback loop or whatsoever. Yeah. Exactly. And so what I also understand from what you're telling me is that a central goal of the lab is really to use AI to identify social inequalities in different domains. But what I was wondering is, how do we ensure such a process that AI or these algorithmic systems do not start to talk for other people instead? Because I often feel that people can really tell their stories about social inequalities that they experience themselves. And I'm wondering, to what extent should an AI tell these stories instead of them? So for instance, you highlighted the example of mobility in the city of Amsterdam. Well, when tramline 14 in Amsterdam was cancelled a few years ago, many people in Amsterdam New West could already tell you that what that meant for their mobility, and I didn't really think that you would need an AI to identify that. So how do you prevent that these models start to talk for the people and instead of the people that should be listened at?
I think it's good to realize that AI should not replace human stories. It should help humans in telling their stories. It should be assisting in that sense. I think it's good to have in mind as well that telling stories or being able to communicate your experiences, your problems, and so forth comes natural to some. People might experience or exercise their rights and privileges to speak up, to be seen, to be represented. But there are also large groups in the city, in the country, worldwide, whom stories and experiences are untold, unheard, and misunderstood. Right? And I think it's also good to look at AI from that perspective. It can help those people in conveying their stories, their issues, their problems. So I agree with you, but it's also good to look at the other way from a perhaps less privileged position to what AI can bring.
Yeah, and how it can give a voice then to people who are previously unheard. Yeah, thank you. Hinda, would you like to add?
Yeah. So I think also another way to look at it, and maybe it's kind of unconventional for a lab that positions itself as an AI lab. We also think very strongly that sometimes our advice to our partners would be, you shouldn't build AI for this, right? Maybe this is not appropriate for your task. And this is why when we are building this effort together with our partners and with the students and all the other researchers that are going to collaborate with us, we're not shy in saying, you know, obviously we're AI researchers, but also sometimes we just advise against developing or automating this task, because then the stakes are too high and we can guarantee that just automating this indeed is going to, you know, only lead to a positive outcome. And maybe if the harm outweighs the good, then that's not a good idea. And this exactly kind of relates to the point you were making, Sarah. You know, what if you're going to basically speak only for, you know, a group of people, but then you're going to leave people out of the conversation. And this is definitely a consideration that we will, you know, include in our research, because we think that indeed sometimes it's not a good idea to automate something and you know, deploy it in a particular domain, and then that will be our answer.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, actually, that I would like to talk a bit more about this idea that you can also advise organizations, public authorities to not deploy a system. And I fully subscribe to that view that sometimes we just should not use certain systems. For example, if we're talking about facial recognition, I mean, we can try to make facial recognition systems such that they work as good as on white people and people of color, but maybe in many cases we should simply not use these systems. But I'm curious then, like, how does that work in practice? If you tell the city of Amsterdam or another organization, well, you should not use this system, won't they then go somewhere else to ask other people to design that or to make that for them? And like, what do you tell your students about them? Do they have really some kind of power, and can they exercise actual influence over these kind of decisions? Or is it more something that is important for your morality as a developer yourself? Yeah, could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so indeed this is a complex problem, right? And not everybody will be in the position to say, actually, I'm not going to build this because, you know, it violates my values and I don't think it's ethical to do it. But we would like to ensure that within our lab, and indeed when it comes to explaining that to our partners and the organizations we work with, it's also about education. It's also about showing the potential harms, right? So there are ways for us to show that indeed, for example, using facial recognition, let's say in the city of Amsterdam at scale, we can explain why that's not a good idea. And indeed, we can use our skills as scientists to show that, you know, based on the demographic of the population of Amsterdam, and given everything that we know about facial recognition and all the mistakes it can make and all the, you know, dramatic consequences for individuals and communities, this is why it wouldn't be a good idea to develop, you know, or at least to deploy this particular system. So I'm not saying this about any facial recognition model, but, you know, this is also a case-per-case kind of approach. But in general, we know that certain technologies and certain solutions have a history of discrimination, right? Whether direct or indirect. So this is also the let's say, the knowledge that we can bring to the organizations we are partnering with. And often, I think people who do own this AI knowledge and people who are developing models in their day-to-day work, they don't always stop and explain to people, you know, the ins and outs of what a model does and when it makes mistakes or not. We often in a situation where, you know, we get a request from the business, we develop our model, we deploy it, next, right? We go to the next task. Here we are like in kind of almost luxurious position where we can take the time to research this for the next few years and to also take the time to explain to our partners and educate them. You know, really, you have a choice. You can decide to you know, choose to use or deploy a model that's potentially harmful, or you can, you know, take a little bit more time to try and study what potential consequences it might have. And the cost of deploying a model that might be, you know, leading to bias and discrimination is way higher than, you know, whatever immediate gains you think you're going to gain with this imperfect model or this potentially biased model you're going to deploy. This is something that we are in a position to actually tackle it and illustrate it and show it. And also, of course, what will work best in this situation is to give an alternative, right? To give an actual solution, because telling people don't use that, it's not going to work. Indeed, then they will go to another company or another research organization that is going to make it work, right? For them, at least on the short term. So the idea for us is also to actually give them solutions and develop alternatives to indeed answer the ask, so the question that they have, the need that they have to deploy a particular technology or, you know, any type of automated system, and also how, you know, they can actually do that in practice.
Thank you. Sennay, would you like to add to that maybe?
Well, there's a little to add to this quite complete answer. One point, perhaps, I think it's extremely important to, when it comes to education, focus on teaching our students to take ownership. And not only the AI students or the data science students, but students in other disciplines as well. This I see not happening enough. And this is also why we try to focus as much as possible when it comes to education on teaching our students how to go about things, how to deal with bias, how to come with creative new solutions, hands-on experiences, things like learning to do algorithmic thinking or coding. I think that's digital literacy in general is extremely important for the general students, not only for the AI data science students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, and I really like the point, Hinda, that you made about it's not just about saying you should not use it, but you should offer an alternative that is maybe less invasive or comes with less risk, and then you can engage, of course, in a discussion with an organization that you're working for. Before I'm going to move on to the questions from the audience, I would like to ask one final question, and then I'll open the floor. And if I may, I would like to ask you to respond to a recent opinion piece that was published in Het Parool, an Amsterdam-based newspaper. And this opinion piece, a student and a researcher at the University of Amsterdam respond to the launch of the research priority area Humane AIs, and that's where we're now in, and the Civic AI Lab. And the authors of the opinion piece argue that the University of Amsterdam and its partners are not really consistent in their efforts to develop fair and equitable AI, as at the same time, the University of Amsterdam is also cooperating with Huawei. And of course, I understand that both of you, Hinda and Sennay, you were not involved in the decision to set up a collaboration with Huawei. And I also do not necessarily want to talk about this specific case, but I would like to ask you to respond to a more general question that I think is expressed in this opinion piece, namely, what is the responsibility of the university in setting up collaborations with industry partners, and how do you navigate this with the Civic AI Lab and maybe other initiatives that you are involved with?
Yeah. So I think we applaud the authors for publicly sharing their opinion on the Dreams lab that you're referring to and its collaboration with Huawei. It's very good that attention is drawn to AI-facilitated human rights violations worldwide, and I think we can say we definitely share the author's concern on how AI can be used to harm individuals and minority groups. At the same time, we also think it can be misleading to take or ask a firm position in the form of for or against, especially when dynamics of power, economics, international relations, technology, and so on, ethics, law are unclear and intertwined. So instead of taking a position as being for or against this particular collaboration or other similar collaborations, I think it's good to engage and elevate the social debate around the role of AI in society, beyond what has been done in the past and is being done now in the present, in order to save, in order to promote agency and influence. So that's a general response.
Thank you. Hinda, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I second Sennay's answer to your question, and indeed, I do think that I find it brave to be able to speak out your opinion like this, and especially in the public venue like a newspaper. I think that's great, and I think it's great that you can do that. And indeed, this is a very complex question, and I think that it can be simply I am for or against. This is an issue that is that concerns me a lot as a citizen, as a person. Yeah, any human being should be concerned by this. But indeed, like Sennay says, what we can do about it in our everyday life, and as you know, as researchers at the Civic AI Lab or at the University of Amsterdam, or as employees of a big corporation, is try to kind of normalize the conversations about this and to make people understand that it's not black and white, right? It's like all sorts of shades of gray, and not just about sources of funding at the university. We can see that in our everyday life, right? We all use apps that have questionable use of our personal data, and then it's also like about us saying, like, can I really afford to not use this app, for example? Will it not affect my contact, the contact I have with my family, for example? So it really makes me think a lot about how much power do I actually have about making these decisions. And I want to educate people around me. I want to educate my parents. I want to educate my friends and family about this isn't just something that the other people are going to think about for you or going to make the decisions for you. This is something we should try to talk about and normalize a debate about it. And I don't think we will have a solution today, but I think that hopefully soon enough we will kind of have solutions around it, and people can then choose what direction to go towards to answer these important questions.
Yeah, and I really agree to that. This is not just a question of institutional responsibility, but something that it's a question that concerns all of us, and also in our daily lives, indeed. Yeah,
exactly. I just wanted to add something, and since I mentioned it, this is also about power and individual agency, right? Like, individually as researchers and as citizens, like, we also need to wonder, like, how much power do I have to change the things that I want to change, and how can I empower myself to do it? And one thing that at least we try to do at the Civic AI Lab is to educate the public, not just people at the municipality or our partners or students. It's also part of the things that we are going to deliver as a Civic AI Lab is also educating the public about these matters, so that they understand that it's not clear-cut, that they also can participate in that conversation.
Yeah. Maybe to connect one of the questions from the audience, Sennay, you mentioned the debate around the role of AI in society, and someone from the audience asked to both of you, where do you think that AI can contribute the most to lead to a fairer or better world, or where is it needed maybe the most, in your opinion?
So one thing that really that is close to my heart is when it comes to healthcare, an opportunity to access to healthcare, but also to personalized medicine, for instance, is something that I think AI is doing, or AI researchers are doing, and making a lot of progress there. And I see it from a personal, let's say, history. I know that I come from, let's say, a subpopulation that, if you give me a blood test, some of my numbers are going to be high or lower than average compared to the Dutch population. And that's not that I am sick, it's just that these are typical metrics for the population where I come from. So of course, if my doctor doesn't know that, right, it's going to kind of lead to bad healthcare, let's say, as the way they're going to take care of me. And I'm thinking that an AI typically will be able to look for patterns across data from different countries, different ethnicities, and that could typically help me, right? So I see like the use for these type of things, I think very promising. just to cite one, and I can, then I'm sure you have other ideas on top of your head.
There are many directions in which I think AI could really benefit people, societies. One of the examples that I always come back to is the one on how to use AI to help people that are seeking refugees. Right? So the Immigration Policy Lab, which is a cooperation between Stanford University and HT Zurich in Switzerland, they developed an algorithm that matches a person, in this case a refugee, with a place based on many different known and unknown qualities of that person, and based on all kinds of characteristics of different places in the country, in Switzerland or in the States, in this case. And in this study, they showed that using such a algorithm that looks at many kinds of thousands of features of places and persons and seeks a match, such an algorithm leads to 30% increase in employment among refugees in Switzerland, in the US, and up to, I believe, 70% in Switzerland. Right? In both cases, algorithmic, so in the US case and in Switzerland case, algorithmic placement of refugees led to a win-win situation. What the refugee and the communities that the refugees are placed in benefit from one another. These are simple, low-hanging fruits that can be boosted and promoted by AI. And this is also why in the past I have been pushing governments to make use of this, especially governments that say that they have issues, problems with placing refugees. I think this type of applications where you can help the less privileged are golden opportunities for AI.
I found it a really interesting example, Sennay, because on the one hand, it sounds indeed really promising and very valuable, but at the same time, I feel that there's also maybe some notion of efficiency about where do you put people that I'm not sure if I think is entirely, I don't know, if I feel completely comfortable with that in such a context.
Yeah, so this is where things often go wrong. People think an algorithm to place refugees. This sounds very technical, bureaucratic. To the contrary, if you compare it to how refugees are placed now, a person looks at a file, has to make a decision, and often they have to make decisions, many decisions with limited time. It's almost a random placement. Whereas if you use an enriched database, if you use more information about places, about persons, you can make a more informed decision. That's also what one of the study that I refer to shows. So it might seem technical, but the way it's been done right now is not efficient, is not helping refugees, because, well, a person cannot look at the thousands of possible matches that could benefit refugees. I see your point, but I also see the immense benefit of doing it this way. And in this case, this algorithm is now being used more often. Multiple governments are trying to put it in practice. Even the Dutch government is now, I happened to learn just last week, made either a decision or at least publicly mentioned it, that they will try this out. These are low-hanging fruits that should be promoted and also presented in venues like this to show people that this is also possible. And often it's perhaps political decisions or dogmas that allow governments, local governments, national governments, not to use such an algorithm, because it could give the impression that, well, refugees come to the Netherlands and they are placed with an algorithm in a very helpful manner that could give the impression to refugees that they should come to the Netherlands. Right? This type of thinking, this hampers algorithms and applications like what I mentioned.
Thank you. And maybe this is actually a good bridge to one of the other questions from the audience, because the question is, could you elaborate on what kind of social science and the humanities ideas of fairness and inequality, and I think you can also add efficiency, play in your own projects and work?
So one example I already gave at the beginning, in the health project, we will be making use of differential fairness, and differential fairness relates to differential privacy and has a relation to the intersectionality theory. Right? How do you look at how inequality propagates through different overlapping identities? These are theories that come from social sciences, from humanities, and get a place in algorithmic development.
Thank you. Hinda, would you like to say something about that too?
Yeah, well, I think since the start of this discussion, I've been telling you about more like in practice how we will do it, and yeah, so part of our way of working is to have, for instance, our PhD researchers having promoters that are indeed like specialized in their domain, but also we have supervisors from other faculties that specialize in different domains, social sciences, law, ethics, etc. So we don't just say that we want to have like a multidisciplinary approach to it. We really want to make sure that in developing our research, we learn from these other domains and that they have an equally important place in the research, and not just to kind of, you know, justify or motivate the research that we do, but because we really want it to be useful and we really want to learn from other domains. And what I often see in you know, among AI researchers is that we're going to make assumptions about what is useful, for example, in terms of, let's say, interaction with the user, for example, but then we're not going to ask, I don't know, cognitive psychologists what they think about it, and because they've been studying that for centuries, you know, for, well, maybe I'm exaggerating, but for decades, right? So typically what we need to do in order to really, you know, make this work and to really learn from these other domains is to make sure that in the structure itself of our research, we give room or seat at a table for these different domains as well.
Thank you. So there's a rather elaborate question in the Q&A, but I want to try to summarize it for you and then address the question to you. So someone is pointing out that there's a problem with bias if you cannot contextualize the nature of the bias in the observed data, and that the person relates this to bias in data and generative mechanisms in the real world. So the question is, given the complexity of these relationships, social technical relationships, how can we ensure that the underrepresented people have their voices heard while building high stakes automated decision-making systems?
Yeah, I'm reading the full question to get an idea of the context.
Yeah, it's hard to summarize it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I haven't read the question, but given your summary, the co-creation, so cooperation, as I mentioned, is important, and co-creation. And with co-creation, I mean creating, developing, testing, monitoring AI together with those for whom AI algorithms are developed. So putting citizens from different communities in the pipeline, that's, I believe, the only way we can incrementally reduce, perhaps not completely eliminate, but reduce biases, reduce discrimination. And this demands from citizens to participate, not only in terms of giving their data or sharing their data, but also sharing their experiences with how algorithms impact them.
Yeah, and then, sorry, and then that can create some context basically around the data as well, then, if I rightly understand.
Exactly. I mean, the context can come from academia, so you can, based on history, social sciences, and so on. But the key thing is that citizens participate and contribute. They will contextualize the data. They will refine the data, cleanse the data in ways that are contemporary, are forward thinking.
Thank you. Hinda, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I think this approach will typically mean that we're trying to have the data that we collect, and in particular within the questions that we're trying to answer, to be more representative, right, of all people that are part of our of our target population, let's say. But I think this also relates to an earlier question that we had, or a discussion that we had about when not to build something, when not to build and deploy an algorithm. And I think this relates to it. So if at some point we see that actually it is just not feasible to collect more representative data for, let's say privacy reasons, we know that we have very constraining GDPR regulation that it is there to protect people's personal data. That also means that indeed we cannot necessarily collect more data to make it more representative and to avoid discrimination or bias. But it could also be in particular situations is actually we are never going to reach a point where we have a data set that's a good representation of society, and it doesn't mean that we don't want. It's not you shouldn't be perceived as we want to give up doing research or developing this. It's just, it's not applicable, right? For certain situation, you should be ready to say, this isn't going to work, even if you collect more data. And this is also something that, I mentioned earlier, that we're also ready to say to our partners, this isn't going to work and we shouldn't build data in this case. And then you have alternative solutions in place, right? Where you indeed still have citizens participating and you can still automate certain parts of your process, but not necessarily by collecting more data, but by having a different approach.
Thank you. And I want to highlight one question from the audience that I also already kind of had a similar question on my list, actually. So someone is asking, how do you make sure with the Civic AI Lab that you not become part of some kind of corporate attempt to use the lab for ethics washing or AI ethics washing? Because I'm sure that there will be some kind of pressure on you at some point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It could be. I mean, we haven't felt the pressure so far. I mean, one of the reasons that we started Civic AI Lab is that we wanted it to be a public cooperation, and that we wanted to be open about the things that we develop, the things that we do, and this is also the way we develop algorithms. We develop software, we share software, and so on. And we will try to keep doing that, and in fact help perhaps private companies to work the way we do, because they also benefit eventually from the fact that citizens, customers, clients trust software, trust algorithms, right? I think Civic AI Lab and other labs will have one big challenge in the coming decade, and that's two things: trust. Many citizens and communities mistrust the use of data and AI by governments, universities, and companies, and rightfully so in many cases, because data have been used against them rather than to empower them. And trust needs to be restored by, in the first place, governments, universities, and companies by developing and deploying AI that probably help citizens and communities. Citizens, clients, customers will demand more openness in the end, and companies, I predict, will come to us to learn how to be open, how to be to build trust with citizens, rather than we adapting technologies or ways that private companies would like us to adopt.
I think that's a very, very, very relevant and legitimate question, and I think you can't have zero risk of that happening. I think we're all conscious of the fact that this could happen, but the way I see it is that the DNA itself of, of this research that we're setting up is that we want it to be useful, right? We want it to be applicable, and we want it to be really answering the questions that are raised by our partners. And when this is your focus, you're also going to kind of safeguard the fact that we don't want to do research or just for the sake of publishing, in nice conferences or journals. We also want to make sure that whatever we come up with is actually answering questions, and that we're building this idea of recourse, right? It's very important and central to what we're trying to achieve here, which is we don't just, give things and deploy things. We also make sure that we build this recourse possibility where people can come back to us and say, we agree, we don't agree, and have this conversation. This is actually part of what we want to achieve in this lab, and is equally important to the more algorithmic side, AI side of things, right? It's not just yet another AI lab. I'm sure that a lot of smart people in the AI community who can develop algorithms, but what we really want to focus on is to make sure that what we do really is useful and answers particular questions, and that it's not just closed once we finish developing a model, for example, but that the conversation continues, and that we build all these recourse opportunities for everybody impacted by the models, so that we can continue learning and fixing and repairing if we have not done things right the first time around.
Yeah, Sennay, I want to come back to something that you just mentioned, because you talked about trust, and that reminded me of something that is, I think, also a struggle or a tension that we see when we're talking about data, privacy, and everything, which is that under data protection laws, people need to be informed. There need to be a lot of transparency around how companies operate or how they use your data and everything. But if, as a company, you give too much detailed explanation, there's a risk that you lose trust, because people understand too well exactly what you're doing. So there is some kind of, you have to find some balance between explaining what you're doing, but also not scaring people or so. How do you also experience that tension in your field, and how do you navigate that, or how do you work around that?
Well, as I said, this is a challenge. I think this is perhaps the biggest challenge that awaits us, and it is a matter of showing by example good AI practices and applications, but in parallel we need to make work of digital literacy and numeracy.
Mm-hmm.
I think all citizens and communities need to have a basic understanding of data science and AI in order to be able not only to participate but also take ownership in the future algorithmic world. And I'm convinced that once people understand that what they can do with their data and with algorithms, then they will be more opener to using their own data or sharing their own data, even use the data of others, of companies, of governments, to control them, right? So to change the perspective, it's not only citizens getting or giving data that is used by governments or companies. It could also be that citizens develop algorithms to control, to check the governments, their companies. So it is a long-term goal and challenge, but I think once you have more digital literacy and abilities to do more with AI and data, then people will be much more open to sharing their data and having trust also in AI.
So we are nearing towards the end, actually. There are still a few other questions in the chat, but unfortunately I can't bring them all to the discussion. So I would actually like to give the floor back to Claes, to the organizers. But from my side, Sennay and Hinda, thanks a lot for the discussion and for the talk. I found it super interesting to hear your thoughts and ideas and hopes. And I'm also really looking forward to see the concrete output of the Civic AI Lab once your PhD students start to produce their first results and everything, and what it will lead to. So I'm looking forward to see all of that.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Let me only repeat what Sarah already said. Thank you to Sennay and to Hinda for a very open and reflective conversation, and I think also a conversation that showcased the importance of thinking about where we are as academics in this discussion. So thank you for that. We look forward to following and interacting with you in the Civic AI Lab. I also want to thank Sarah a lot for your wonderful moderation of this panel, and also Gionata, who is always behind the scenes when doing this. We'll be back again in March with another conversation, so stay tuned for that. You can follow the research priority area on Twitter, and also find all the information in the chat as well as on the Humane AI website. Thank you all very much.